Daddies with no money don't deserve kids. That's what my ex-wife said in court, smiling like she just delivered the punchline of a joke. I can still see her lipstick smudge on the edge of the coffee cup she brought to the hearing. Like this was just another business meeting. The words hit me harder than the judge's gavel. In that single sentence, everything I'd built, everything I thought I was, came crashing down. My name is Michael Grant. Back then I was 34. Living in a modest house on the edge of Austin, Texas. Working nights as a logistics supervisor at an Amazon fulfillment center. My wife Lauren and I had been together for 10 years. Our daughter, Emma, was 5. The light of my life. I thought our little family had something real. We didn't have much. But we had enough. Or at least, that's what I told myself. The courtroom smelled like old wood and stale coffee. Lauren sat across from me, flawless in her navy dress, her lawyer whispering things that made her nod without emotion. Beside her was Trevor Holloway, my cousin. He wasn't supposed to be there, but of course he was. He had his slick gray suit, his Rolex catching the light every time he checked his phone. The man she'd left me for. The judge's voice was steady, calm, detached. As she read through the decision, primary custody will be awarded to Mrs. Lauren Holloway. Mr. Grant will retain visitation rights 1 weekend per month and 2 weeks each summer. The words blurred together. I heard the rest. Something about financial stability, educational opportunities, quality of life. But they all just meant one thing: I wasn't enough. When it was over, Lauren stood up gracefully and shook her lawyer's hand and gave Trevor a look that told me everything. He slid an arm around her waist, and they walked out together. I stayed frozen in my seat, my hands gripping the edges of the table, like if I let go, I'd fall apart. Outside the courthouse, the sky had that heavy, gray look before a storm. I heard small footsteps behind me. Emma ran toward me, pigtails bouncing, her pink dress soaked from the drizzle. She threw herself into my arms. Daddy, are we still going to the zoo this weekend? I held her tighter, my throat burning. Not this weekend, sweetie, but soon. Okay. Lauren's voice cut through the air. Emma, come on. We have to go. Emma looked at her mother, then back at me. Can I stay with Daddy tonight? Lauren didn't answer. Trevor did. Not tonight. Kiddo, Daddy's got to work. I looked at him. Really looked at him. And, for a second, I thought about breaking his perfect smile with my fist. But Emma's little hand was in mine, trembling. So I let go. Lauren crouched down beside Emma, her tone suddenly soft. Rehearsed. Sweetheart, Daddy loves you. But Mommy's going to make sure you have everything you need. A nice house. A good school. Maybe even ballet lessons. Emma's eyes lit up at the word ballet. She nodded, innocent and trusting. And that's when I felt something crack inside me. Lauren straightened up, gave me one last glance, and said quietly, so only I could hear, "You can't raise a child on love, Michael. You need money for that." Then she turned away, walking toward Trevor's black Tesla. I stood there holding my daughter's backpack, still warm from her shoulders. Rain started to fall harder, soaking through my cheap suit. Emma turned back once, waved with her little hand, then disappeared inside the car. The taillights blurred red through the rain until they vanished completely. That night, I sat in my empty apartment, the one I'd just rented after losing the house. The smell of old carpet and takeout containers hung in the air. I poured the last of my cheap whiskey into a glass and stared at the blank wall. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled. I thought about the judge's words, about Lauren's laugh, about Trevor's smirk, about Emma's tiny voice asking if we'd still go to the zoo. I'd never felt smaller. But somewhere between the bitterness and the silence, something shifted. I looked around at the stacks of cardboard boxes I hadn't unpacked, the half-empty bottle on the counter, and realized this was it. The bottom. There was nowhere left to fall. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the pictures of Emma on the screen. Her missing front tooth, her purple dress at her last birthday, the way she laughed when she tried to feed the ducks. I whispered to no one, "You deserve better than this, kiddo." That's when I made a promise. If the world wanted to measure my worth in money, I'd beat them at their own game. Not for revenge. Not even for Lauren. For Emma. For every father who ever got told he wasn't enough because he couldn't buy his child a bigger house or a fancier school. The next morning, before the sun came up, I put on my work boots, drove back to the warehouse, and clocked in. The fluorescent lights flickered as I walked through the rows of pallets. My reflection stared back at me from a metal door, tired eyes, unshaven face. But something new behind them. I wasn't broken anymore. I was building something. They just didn't know it yet. I woke up before the sun. The same way I had every morning since the divorce. The alarm buzzed at 4:15. And for a second I just stared at the cracked ceiling above my bed. Listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the next room, the place smelled faintly of oil and dust from the auto shop below. It wasn't much, but it was what I could afford. Rent was cheap. And the landlord didn't ask questions. I splashed cold water on my face, pulled on my work boots, and drove across the quiet Dallas streets to the warehouse. The city felt different at that hour, empty but alive. Like it was holding its breath before the day began. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered as I clocked in. The same rhythm every night: scan, lift, load, stack, repeat. People came and went. Some complained about overtime, others about their paychecks. I just worked. I didn't have the energy for anything else. Every dollar I made went to rent, child support, and the savings jar I kept on the counter, labeled Emma's Future in black marker. On my breaks, I'd check my phone, scrolling through old photos of Emma, her missing tooth, her little pink backpack, her birthday cake that said, "To the moon and back." Lauren never sent new pictures. Sometimes she ignored my calls. When she did answer, it was only to remind me that Emma had ballet lessons now, or that she needed a new tablet for school. I'd say I'd take care of it, and she'd laugh quietly before hanging up. One Friday night, after a 14-hour shift, I sat in my car outside the warehouse, too tired to drive. My hands ached. My back felt like it was splitting in two. I leaned my head against the steering wheel and whispered, "You're doing this for her." I didn't realize one of my coworkers, Hank, had walked by until I heard his voice. "You talking to yourself again?" "Mike, guess so," I said, forcing a smile. He handed me a cup of gas station coffee. "You ever think, maybe this ain't worth it? All the hours, all the grind." I took a sip. It was bitter and lukewarm. "I don't get to think like that, Hank. Not anymore." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I used to say the same thing." Then he walked off, leaving me in the hum of the parking lot lights. That night, I went home and sat in the dark for a long time. I pulled out an old laptop I'd nearly pawned twice and opened a browser. I didn't know what I was looking for until I typed logistics management online courses. Page after page of results. My brain screamed that I was too tired, too broke, too late. But something in me said different. Over the next few months, I worked nights and studied days. Sometimes I'd fall asleep at my desk with a pen still in my hand. I watched videos about supply chain optimization, warehousing systems, data analysis. Half the time I didn't understand what I was reading, but I kept going. Every test I passed felt like a small rebellion against the world that said I couldn't change. When I called Emma, I tried to sound upbeat. Guess what? Sweetheart, Daddy's learning new things at work. She giggled. Like what? Like how to make deliveries faster. She thought about it. Then said, Mom says, Uncle Trevor makes people faster too. He hires lots of them. I forced a chuckle. Yeah, I bet he does. After we hung up, I stared at the phone for a long time. Trevor's name felt like a splinter in my chest. I knew he'd been helping Lauren buy that big house in Los Angeles. I knew he was the reason Emma had the best private school. Ballet lessons. All the things Lauren said she deserved. I wasn't angry that my daughter had nice things. I was angry that Lauren had turned them into proof that I didn't belong in her world. By the end of 2018, I had completed my certification in supply chain analytics. It didn't mean much, but it made me believe I could build something of my own. I started staying late after shifts, talking to drivers, learning routes, asking how the system really worked. Most of them laughed when I asked questions. Mike, you planning to write a book about this dump? One guy joked. Maybe, I said, but I'm starting with a business plan. They thought I was kidding. Maybe I was. One night, after clocking out, I stood in the loading bay watching the trucks roll into the dark. Each one carried thousands of dollars in product, moving across Texas and beyond. The whole system was a living thing, breathing through data and timing and human sweat. If you could understand it, maybe you could control it. That thought wouldn't leave me. At home, I filled notebooks with sketches of routes and delivery times, ideas for apps that could track shipments better than the clunky software we used. I didn't know anything about startups or investors. I just knew I was tired of cleaning up after other people's success. One night in early 2019, Hank found me hunched over my laptop in the break room. You still at it? He asked, raising an eyebrow, trying to figure out how to make deliveries faster and cheaper. I said without looking up. He laughed. Amazon's been trying to do that for years. You think you'll beat them? I looked at him, dead serious. Yeah, someday. He stared for a second, then smiled. Damn. Mike, you're crazy enough. Maybe you will. When I got home that morning, I opened a new page in my notebook and wrote 4 words at the top. It wasn't a company yet. It wasn't even a plan. Just an idea and a tired man who refused to stay small. The sun started to rise through my window, streaking gold over the oil-stained floor. I stood there, watching the light spread, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the day was something to survive. It felt like something I was finally ready to fight for. The morning light had barely touched the rooftops when I walked into the diner off Route 67 with a notebook under my arm and a head full of ideas I didn't quite know how to explain. The smell of bacon and burnt coffee filled the air. And in the corner sat Henry Collins, an old coworker from the warehouse. He'd left the company a year earlier to manage a small trucking operation out near Fort Worth. He looked up as I slid into the booth across from him. You look like hell. Mike. Thanks, I said, flipping open my notebook. I've got something I want to show you. Henry leaned back, squinting at me. Last time you said that, you tried to convince me to eat canned chili for a week so you could save for your kid's birthday. This is different, I said. I think I can make deliveries faster. Cheaper too. No middlemen, No wasted miles. I sketched a few lines on the paper. Routes connecting dots across Texas. Notes about time. Fuel costs. Warehouse storage. Henry watched in silence. After a minute, he said, "You're serious about this?" "I've been serious since the day they told me I wasn't good enough to raise my daughter," I said quietly. Henry rubbed his jaw. "You got money for this?" "Not really. I've got some savings. And I can sell my truck." He sighed, took a long sip of coffee, and muttered, "You're out of your damn mind. But I like it." That's how Redline Logistics was born. Not in some boardroom. Not with investors or fancy software. Just two broke guys. One old pickup. And a rented storage unit we turned into an office. The walls were bare except for a whiteboard with scribbles that looked more like prayers than plans. The first few months were brutal. We slept 4 hours a night. Took any job we could get. We'd haul furniture one day. Frozen chicken the next. Henry drove most nights while I handled dispatch calls from a second-hand laptop that overheated every hour. There were times I thought about quitting, especially when the bills piled up. One evening, I stood outside the storage unit as the sun went down, watching trucks roar by on the highway. My phone buzzed. It was Lauren. "You're late on support again," she said. "I sent the payment yesterday. Bank must have held it." She sighed dramatically. "Emma needs a new tablet for school. Trevor says you should focus on your own life instead of playing hero." I gritted my teeth. "Tell Trevor I'm doing fine." "Fine isn't good enough for our daughter," she said, then hung up. I threw the phone onto the passenger seat and sat there in the silence. That old voice in my head whispered that she was right. Maybe I wasn't enough, but I pushed it down and drove back to work. Weeks later, Henry called me into the office, grinning. "You're not going to believe this. A local grocery chain wants a short-term delivery contract. 30 stores. 2 months." I blinked. How the hell did that happen? He tossed me an email printout. They saw our ad online. Said we were the only ones who called back same day. We spent the next 48 hours prepping for the deal. We hired 2 part-time drivers and borrowed trucks from a friend of Henry's. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid. For the first time in a long while, I saw numbers in our bank account that didn't make me sick. We celebrated with cheap burgers and warm beer. Henry raised his bottle. To Redline. The little company stupid enough to try. To Redline. I said. But success has a way of drawing attention. And not always the good kind. A month later, we got a call from a supplier, canceling a contract out of nowhere. Then another. And another. When I asked why, one of them said quietly, "Look, Mike, we heard some things. Heard you're in trouble with taxes. Maybe late on insurance. Can't risk it." My stomach dropped. I knew exactly who was behind it. Trevor. He'd always been competitive. Even when we were kids. The kind of guy who needed to win every argument. Every bet. Every girl. Now he had money. Influence. And more friends in business circles than I could count. I called him that night. "Trevor, I know you've been making calls," I said. He laughed softly. "You think you're that important? Mike, I've got bigger things to worry about than your little side hustle." "Funny," I said, "because my side hustle just took 2 of your delivery clients." There was silence on the line. Then a chuckle. "You really think you can play in my league? Stick to warehouses? Cousin, you were built to follow orders, not give them." He hung up before I could answer. That night, I sat in the truck with my head against the steering wheel, the engine ticking quietly as it cooled. For a long time, I didn't move. Then I reached into the glove box and pulled out Emma's drawing from years ago. It was a stick figure version of us holding hands, standing under a blue sky with the words, "Me and Daddy," written in crayon. I looked at it until my eyes burned. The next morning, I drove straight to Henry's house. "We're not quitting," I told him. He looked at me, half asleep, holding a coffee mug. "Who said we were?" "I mean it," I said. "They can take clients. It spread rumors. Whatever. But they can't take the work from us. Not if we outwork them." Henry smirked. "You've officially lost it." "Probably," I said. "You in?" He grinned. "Hell yes." From that day on, we worked harder than ever. We knocked on doors, made cold calls, offered delivery deals so low they couldn't say no. Slowly, we started to rebuild. Word got around that Redline never missed a deadline. No matter how small the job. One afternoon, as I was loading boxes into a truck, my phone buzzed. A small grocery owner I'd begged for weeks to give us a shot finally said yes. It wasn't a big contract, but it was ours. When I climbed into the driver's seat, sweat dripping down my neck, Henry slapped the side of the truck. "You know what this means." "Right, we're still alive." I smiled. Barely. Barely's enough. As the sun set behind the Texas hills, I looked at the road ahead and thought about what Hank had told me months ago, that maybe it wasn't worth it. He was wrong. Every scraped knuckle, every sleepless night, every insult I'd swallowed, it all mattered. We were still small, still broke, still hanging by a thread. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was climbing instead of falling. By the spring of 2021, Redline was finally turning real profit. We had 10 trucks, 2 small warehouses, and a crew that believed in what we were building. The long nights were paying off. Though I barely slept, every deal felt like a battle won. Every invoice, a step closer to proving that I wasn't the failure they said I was. But success came with its own kind of exhaustion. I was working 80 hours a week, sleeping on the couch in the office more often than my own bed. Henry kept warning me I was burning out. "You can't run a company if you're dead." "Mike," he'd say. I'd just laugh and tell him I'd rest when the job was done. The problem was, the job was never done. One night, as I was going through the books, my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I knew the tone as soon as I answered. "Michael, this is Lauren's attorney. She's filing a motion with the court regarding visitation rights." My stomach sank. Visitation rights? I haven't missed a weekend. "She's requesting modifications. She believes your current work schedule and living situation are not suitable for your daughter." I rubbed my temples, trying to breathe. What's this really about? There was a pause. Then the lawyer said quietly, "She's claiming you're too focused on work and that your environment isn't stable for a child." I hung up and stared at the floor. The air in the room felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. After everything, after the years of grinding just to survive, she was still trying to take what little I had left. I called Charles Reed the next morning. He was an old college friend turned family lawyer. When he picked up, I didn't bother with small talk. "Charles, she's doing it again. I need your help." He said, "I'll look into it. Mike, come by the office this afternoon." Charles worked out of a converted house in downtown Dallas. The walls were lined with dusty books and framed law degrees. He listened while I explained everything, his face unreadable. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "You've done everything right. But that's not what matters in family court. They'll look at stability. Who provides the most consistent environment? I've been building a company. That's for her. I know that, he said. But they'll say you're obsessed with work. You're not around. And if Trevor's backing her financially, they'll use that too. I clenched my fists. She's using my success against me. Charles nodded. Welcome to family law. The hearing was 2 weeks later. Same courthouse. Same cold smell of bleach and old carpet. Lauren sat with her lawyer. Immaculate as always. Trevor was beside her again. Like he couldn't resist the spotlight. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it short. Your Honor, I've never missed a visit. I've built a stable business. I'm not some absent father. Everything I do is for Emma. Lauren's lawyer stood. Mr. Grant, would you say you work long hours? Yes. Do you live alone? Yes. Do you sometimes sleep at your office? Sometimes. Yes. When we're busy. So you admit you're consumed by your job, that you have no time for family life. I shook my head. That's not what I said. He smiled like a man who already won. Your Honor, this is precisely our concern. Mr. Grant confuses ambition with stability. Ms. Holloway's home provides consistency, structure, and care. The judge, an older woman with tired eyes, looked at me with something like pity. She spoke gently, but the words cut deep. Mr. Grant, no one doubts your love for your daughter. But love and availability are not the same. The motion to restrict visitation outside the agreed schedule is approved. I felt the ground tilt under me. Lauren didn't smile this time. But the satisfaction in her eyes said everything. After court, I sat in my truck for almost an hour, staring at the steering wheel. Henry called 3 times before I finally answered. You okay? He asked. No. You want to talk about it? No. He paused, then said quietly, You coming in? Yeah. I said, I'll be there. When I got to the office, Henry was waiting by the door. You look like hell. Court went about how I expected. He nodded. So, what now? I poured myself a cup of coffee that tasted like burnt rubber. Now we keep going. Over the next few months, I threw myself into work harder than ever. We landed 2 major contracts with regional distributors, enough to double our fleet. I hired new drivers, expanded our Dallas warehouse, and pushed Redline further than I thought possible. But I was running on fumes. My back ached constantly. I barely ate. The only thing that kept me going was the picture of Emma I kept taped to my desk. One night, Henry came in while I was still working. Mike. Go home. He said. I am home. I muttered. He sat across from me. You know, I used to think success fixed everything. Money. Respect. All that. But watching you, I'm not so sure. I looked up. You saying this isn't worth it. He shook his head. I'm saying I don't think you know what you're trying to win anymore. His words stayed with me. Even after he left. Even after the lights went out. I couldn't shake them. That weekend, I drove to Austin for my monthly visit with Emma. Lauren opened the door. Her arms crossed. You're late. Traffic, I said, forcing a smile. Where's Emma? She's at a friend's house. I'll go get her. When she returned, Emma ran up and hugged me, her backpack bouncing against her side. Hi. Daddy. That hug was everything I needed. We spent the day at the park, feeding ducks, eating ice cream, laughing like time hadn't stolen years from us. As the sun set, she asked. Daddy, why does Mom say you love work more than me? I froze. She says that. She nodded. She says that's why you don't live with us. Because you picked work. I swallowed hard. Sweetheart, I work because I love you. Everything I do. It's for you. She looked up at me with those big brown eyes that looked so much like mine. Will you ever stop working so we can be together again? I didn't have an answer. I just hugged her tighter. That night, after I dropped her off, I sat in my truck outside Lauren's house watching the lights go out one by one. I thought about what Henry had said, about what the judge had said, about what Emma had asked. Maybe they were all right. Maybe I didn't know what I was trying to win anymore. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. I wasn't done fighting for my daughter. Not yet. The Monday after that visit, I sat at my desk before dawn and stared at the whiteboard like it was a map out of a burning house. The question was no longer how to beat Trevor or impress a judge. The question was how to build a future Emma could stand on without asking anyone for permission. Work had always been the answer. But work without a plan was just motion. I picked up a marker and started drawing lines between the problems I could control and the ones I could not. By spring, the country was still limping through supply shortages and broken schedules. If there was one thing I understood, it was that predictable beats perfect. I told Henry we were done chasing random loads and started pitching our reliability like a religion. We sold a simple promise to regional grocers and medical suppliers. We pick up on time. We deliver on time. We tell you the truth when a storm or a bridge closure is going to break the plan. Clients did not need poetry. They needed sleep. We bought 2 used tractors that looked like they had stories to tell and hired 3 more drivers out of Waco and Abilene. I spent nights building spreadsheets that tried to match lanes to fuel prices and driver hours without breaking anyone. A kid on our dispatch team showed me a routing script he had tinkered with. It was ugly but smarter than the software we were renting. I paid him a bonus and told him to keep going. Inside 6 months, the script became a tool. We could see slack in the system and steal back minutes that used to die at docks and lights. Money started to feel less like a rumor. I moved out of the apartment above the auto shop and into a 1-bedroom closer to the warehouse. I still slept on the office couch when we had storms or a sick driver. But I started to eat meals that were not from vending machines. On Sundays, I ran through the neighborhood at sunrise and tried to remember what breathing without panic felt like. Then Lauren called. Her voice had that clean edge it always had when she was delivering a message she had already rehearsed. Emma has been accepted to a private academy in Los Angeles. Trevor is handling the tuition. She paused, then added that it would be better if I focused on being consistent with my weekends. I thanked her for telling me and ended the call before I said something I would regret. I stood in the parking lot with the phone in my hand until the Texas heat turned the screen warm. I could not give my daughter a mansion on a hill. But I could give her a bridge to anything she wanted to learn. That thought took root and did not let go. I made a list of people who knew more than I did. At the top was Cynthia Morales, a financial advisor Henry knew from church, who had helped a few small businesses set up charitable funds. She walked into our office with a legal pad and the kind of calm you only get from cleaning up messes for a living. She listened while I explained what I wanted. I told her I wanted a way to help kids like Emma without turning it into a billboard. I told her I did not want a photo on a wall or a ribbon cutting. I wanted students to graduate without debt and without knowing my name. Cynthia drew boxes and arrows and asked hard questions. How much can you commit without choking your growth? Do you want a board or a single trustee? Are you comfortable with matching grants and needs testing? I did not enjoy those questions. But I knew they were the ones that would keep the foundation from becoming another one of my promises scribbled in a notebook. She proposed a donor-advised fund through a community foundation in Dallas. It would let us remain anonymous while directing the money to specific schools. We could start small. Measure. Then, scale. I signed the papers in a conference room that smelled like furniture polish and quiet ambition. On the way out, I held the folder against my chest like it was a passport. The Grant Scholars Fund. It looked ordinary printed in that basic font. It felt anything but. The first semester we targeted 3 high schools across Texas, where guidance counselors said great kids were turning down acceptance letters because the loans scared their families. We set up last-mile scholarships that paired with federal aid, so the math finally worked. Cynthia handled the details. I wrote checks and kept my mouth shut. I told no one except Henry. He read the memo twice and looked at me like he had not seen me in a while. He said I was still a fool, but finally a useful kind of fool. Work did not slow down. A storm chewed up I-35 and shut half our lanes for 2 days. Drivers doubled back on farm roads, and we still hit our delivery windows with minutes to spare. A state emergency office called after hearing from one of our medical clients. They needed a regional partner that could move oxygen tanks and portable generators without drama. Henry and I drove to Austin and sat through a meeting that felt like a test you cannot study for. They asked how many units we could stage within 24 hours after a power event. They asked what our plan was for driver rest compliance in a crisis. I told the truth. We do not promise capacity we do not have. We will never put a tired driver on a dark road. We left without any sense of how it had gone. A week later, they sent a contract so clean I thought it was a mistake. Redline grew into 6 states by early 2022. We did not win by being flashy. We won by not lying. The routing tool became real software. We could see where a flat would probably happen before it did because the sensor data was whispering about it. Drivers started getting home for dinner more often. They told me they had not worked at a company that respected time like it mattered. Respect is contagious. Turnover fell. Clients noticed. I kept waiting for the call that would say it was all going away. The call that would remind me I was still the guy in the cheap suit standing in the rain outside a courthouse. It never came. A different call did. Emma called me on a Thursday after school. Her voice sounded older. She said she had applied to UCLA because their design program looked like magic. She said she did not think she would get in. I told her she was wrong. A month later, she called again and said she had gotten the letter. She sounded like she was trying not to scream. Lauren took the phone and said tuition and housing would be handled, and that I could contribute by being realistic about my time with Emma during the semester. I said I would always be realistic about school. I did not tell her that my hands were already reaching for the folder with the fund. Cynthia and I spoke about UCLA for exactly 9 minutes. She said the fund could support a cohort at the university if we partnered with their financial aid office. We could place restrictions to avoid conflicts of interest. We could designate fields of study that aligned with our company's community focus. She said there was a way to structure matching grants so that our dollars triggered more dollars from alumni networks. She said if we did it right, the dollars would multiply without our names ever attached. That sounded like power without the noise. The first check cleared in May. I did not go to a ceremony. No one handed me a plaque. I went back to the office and signed paperwork on refrigerated trailers. That night, I sat in the parking lot and watched the sky go from blue to that soft, pale orange that makes you think about the first time your kid said a big word. I imagined Emma stepping onto that campus with a backpack full of pens and impossible ideas. I imagined her walking into a studio and realizing she belonged. I did not need anyone to know that I had paid for the light bulbs in that room. I needed her to feel like the lights were always going to come on. A week later, I was scrolling through the UCLA site on my laptop. A small press release mentioned a new scholarship initiative from an anonymous donor managed through a Dallas community fund. It listed 15 recipients by first name and last initial. Emma G. was on the list. I read that line until the words blurred. Henry walked in without knocking and saw the screen. He asked if I was finally looking for a beach vacation. I told him no. I told him I was learning how to breathe again. He dropped into the chair across from me and kicked his boots up on a box that said dry goods. He told me he used to think revenge meant standing in front of the person who hurt you and making them watch you win. He said this version looked quieter and somehow heavier. I did not say anything. He did not need me to. We pushed through summer with the kind of focus I used to reserve for panic. The state contract turned into a federal bid for disaster prep lanes across the Southwest. Our software drew routes that made sense to engineers and drivers at the same time, which is rarer than most people think. We did not get every bid, but the ones we got were worth the sleep we lost. On a Sunday in August, I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of bills and a letter from UCLA that had made its way to my home address through the Community Foundation. Thank you for your support of first-generation and returning students. I traced the embossed seal with my thumb and thought about the way Lauren used to talk about opportunity like it was a brand sold in boutiques. Opportunity is quieter than that. It looks like a line item that makes a number change from impossible to enough. That night I called Emma. We talked about her class schedule and a professor who wore old sneakers and talked fast. She sounded happy and scared, which is the right mix for the start of anything worth doing. When she asked how work was, I told her we were busy in a good way. I did not tell her about the check or the fund. I wanted her to own every step she took on that campus without wondering who had laid the bricks. After we hung up, I sat there listening to the refrigerator hum and the air conditioner kick on and off. The room felt full of a future I could not quite see yet. I opened my laptop and added a note to the fund. Increase annual allocation for university partners by 20% if year-end margins hold. It was the least romantic sentence I had ever written. It was also a love letter. I closed the laptop and leaned back in the chair until I could see the ceiling fan circle slowly above me. For the first time since the courthouse, I did not feel like I was bracing for the punch. I felt like I had moved the fight to a place where I could win without throwing a single one. In the morning the phone would ring and it would be another load tender or a driver asking about a tire that looked wrong. And I would handle it. Tonight I let the quiet settle. Somewhere in Los Angeles, my daughter was reading a syllabus under a lamp I would never see. That was enough. 3 weeks passed before I heard from Emma again. It was a Sunday night. And I was still at the office finishing payroll when her name lit up my phone. Her voice was calm. Lighter somehow. Like California had taught her to breathe differently. She told me about her classes, her new roommate, and the ocean view from her dorm window. I could hear the excitement under every word. And I tried to match it, even though I was staring at spreadsheets under fluorescent lights. When she said she missed home, I wanted to tell her I'd trade everything I owned to stand on that campus with her for just one day. Instead, I said I was proud of her. After we hung up, I sat there a while, letting the silence fill the room. I thought I had made peace with distance. But that night, it felt heavier. I went home and found the old drawing she made when she was little. The one of us holding hands under a crooked sun. It was taped to my refrigerator. I stood there, staring at it, and realized that, no matter how much I built, there would always be that empty space where time used to be. 2 months later, Redline hit its biggest milestone yet. We landed a federal emergency response contract that tripled our fleet overnight. The numbers didn't even look real. I should have been celebrating, but something about it scared me. Growth meant pressure. Pressure meant mistakes, and mistakes were expensive. One Friday morning, I was in the middle of a meeting when Henry burst into my office. He never interrupted me unless something was wrong. "Mike, we got a problem out west," he said. "One of the supply runs near Phoenix. Truck rolled over. No injuries. But the load's gone." "How gone?" "Insurance will cover part of it. But the client's already calling for penalties." I nodded, grabbed my keys, and said I'd handle it personally. Henry tried to stop me, but I needed to see it myself. I drove through the night, the desert stretching for miles under a sky full of stars. When I got to the site, The truck looked like a twisted shell of metal. The driver, Luis, sat on the curb, shaking but alive. I hit a tire tread. "Boss," he said. Swerved to miss it. Trailer flipped. I patted his shoulder. "You did the right thing." We talked to the cops, the tow company, and the client. It was messy but fixable. What wasn't fixable was the storm that followed. Someone leaked the incident to the press, and by Monday, a business blog had published a story about Redline's growing pains. It was small, barely noticed. But Trevor noticed. He sent me a text that read, "Looks like even big shots crash sometimes. Must sting." Huh. I didn't reply. A week later, Lauren called. "Trevor saw that article," she said, her tone sharp. "Emma did too. She asked if your company's in trouble." "It's not," I said. "Good. Because the last thing she needs is another disappointment." That cut deeper than she knew. That night, I sat in my truck outside the warehouse long after everyone went home. I scrolled through the article again and again. I wasn't angry at the reporter or even Trevor. I was angry at myself for letting them live rent-free in my head. Then something strange happened. Around midnight, an old woman walked up to my truck window. She was small, maybe in her 70s. With silver hair and a cane, she tapped on the glass gently. And I rolled it down. "Are you Michael Grant?" she asked. Her voice soft but steady. "Yes." "Ma'am?" I said, confused. She smiled faintly. "I thought so. You look just like your mother." The air left my lungs. "I think you're mistaken. Ma'am, my mother passed away when I was a baby." "I know," she said. "She was my daughter." I stared at her, unable to speak. She handed me an envelope with trembling hands. "I've been looking for you for a very long time. I didn't think I'd get the chance to see you before I go. Everything you need to know is in here." Before I could ask anything, she turned and started walking away toward a silver sedan parked under the streetlight. I stepped out of the truck and called after her, but she only waved without looking back. I opened the envelope right there on the hood of my truck. Inside was a photograph. Yellowed with age, a young woman stood in front of an old Chevy, smiling at a man I recognized instantly. My father. There was also a handwritten letter. "Michael, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I made mistakes you didn't deserve to pay for. When your mother died, I blamed your father. I thought I was protecting her memory by cutting him out of mine. I didn't know I was cutting you out too. I built a company. I built walls. And I built a life that meant nothing because it didn't have you in it. I can't ask for forgiveness, but I can leave you what should have been yours. Go to the address written below. It's time you learned who you really are." Underneath was an address in Houston and a business card that said Whitmore Medical Group. The name on the back was Eleanor Whitmore. I didn't sleep that night. I drove to Houston the next morning. The building was sleek. Glass and steel. The kind of place that made you feel small before you even walked in. The receptionist asked my name, and when I told her, her eyes widened. "Please wait here," she said. A few minutes later, a man in a gray suit walked out. "Mr. Grant, I'm sorry for your loss," he said. "Ms. Whitmore passed away last month, but she left instructions in her will that if you ever came, we were to give you this." He handed me another envelope, heavier than the first. Inside was a deed, a trust document, and a letter addressed simply, "For my grandson." The words blurred as I read them. She wrote about regret, about my mother, about how she'd spent her life building an empire in the medical industry only to realize too late that it couldn't heal what she'd broken. She wrote that everything she had was mine now. The company. The assets. The accounts. I sat there in that glass office, holding a letter that didn't feel real. I thought about my father. About all those years he'd worked double shifts. About how he never told me a thing. Maybe he'd wanted to protect me from this world. The lawyer cleared his throat. There's one more thing. Mr. Grant. Ms. Whitmore asked that you use what she's left you to help others the way your mother would have wanted. She said you'd know what that meant. I nodded slowly. I knew exactly what it meant. When I drove back to Dallas that evening, the city skyline looked different. The same streets. The same lights. But everything felt heavier. I wasn't just the man who'd built Redline anymore. I was the man who'd inherited the power to change everything. The road ahead was long. But for the first time, I didn't feel like I was driving toward something to prove. I was driving toward something to finish. When I got back to Dallas, the city lights felt sharper. Almost electric. I drove past the Redline warehouse and parked in front, just staring at the logo on the building. My name wasn't on it, but it might as well have been carved into every wall inside. I'd built this place from nothing. But now I had something else, something I hadn't asked for and didn't know how to carry. Inside my office. I opened the trust papers again. The numbers didn't make sense at first. Hundreds of millions in assets. Ownership stakes in Whitmore Medical. Real estate across 3 states. It wasn't wealth. It was an empire. The woman who'd spent decades pretending I didn't exist had left me everything. Henry showed up around 9 that night. He'd gotten used to finding me still working long after everyone else went home. You look like you saw a ghost, he said, dropping a sandwich on my desk. Close, I said, sliding the papers toward him. He glanced over them, then froze. Holy hell. Mike. What is this? My grandmother, I said. Apparently she owned half the hospitals in Texas. She died last month and left it all to me. He whistled low. You're kidding. I wish I was. I don't even know what to do with it. Henry leaned back, eyes still scanning the documents. Well, first off, breathe. Second, maybe don't tell anybody yet. Especially not the people who think you're just the logistics guy from nowhere. I nodded slowly. Yeah. No one needs to know. Not Lauren. Not Trevor. Not even Emma. Henry grinned. You sure? That'd wipe that smug grin off Trevor's face faster than a tax audit. I almost smiled. Tempting. But I've got other plans. That night, I called Cynthia, the financial advisor who'd helped set up the scholarship fund. She picked up on the second ring. Michael. I was just reviewing the quarterly reports. What's going on? I need your help again. I said. Something big just landed in my lap, and I don't want to waste it. She met me the next morning in a quiet cafe. I handed her the trust documents and told her everything. She read in silence, her expression shifting from confusion to shock. This isn't just inheritance, she said finally. This is a controlling interest in a major corporation. If you activate these rights, you'll be CEO overnight. I shook my head. I don't want the title. I want control. Not attention. Can we set it up so Redline stays separate, but benefits from the infrastructure? She smiled. That's going to take some careful structuring. But it's doable. You'd have to sign on as a silent owner. Maybe set up a parent company. Do it, I said, but keep my name off everything public. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, legal calls, and signatures. I felt like I was living 2 lives. During the day, I was the same man running a logistics company out of a converted warehouse. At night, I was signing documents that moved more money than I'd ever imagined. But something inside me started to change. For years, every decision I'd made came from survival. Now, for the first time, I had the power to do something different. One Friday evening, after a long meeting, I drove to Los Angeles. I didn't tell anyone, not even Henry. I just packed a small bag and started driving west. I needed to see Emma. When I got there, UCLA's campus was alive with music and laughter. Students hurried between buildings, sunlight catching on their backpacks and phones. I spotted Emma near the art building, sketchbook tucked under her arm, hair pulled back just like her mother used to wear it. I almost didn't recognize her. She'd grown taller, more confident, like she belonged in that world completely. I stood there for a while before she noticed me. "Dad," she said, smiling wide. She ran up and hugged me. "What are you doing here?" "Just passing through," I said. "Thought I'd surprise you." She laughed. "You could have called first." "I wanted to see your face." We spent the afternoon walking through campus. She showed me her favorite study spot, the tiny coffee shop that made lattes strong enough to keep her awake through finals. Every story she told made me prouder. As the sun started to set, we sat on a bench near the sculpture garden. She leaned her head on my shoulder. "You know, Mom and Trevor came to visit last month," she said. "He kept talking about business and real estate. Everyone around him always looks like they're waiting for permission to breathe." I chuckled softly. "That sounds like him." She looked up at me. "You're different now. Dad, you smile more. You don't sound tired anymore." I didn't know what to say. Maybe because for the first time in my life, she was right. When I dropped her off at her dorm, she hugged me again. "I'm really glad you came," she said. "Me too, kiddo." Driving back to Texas, I thought about how far we'd both come. She didn't need to know how her tuition was being paid or how much I'd changed her life behind the curtain. That was between me and the ghosts I'd inherited. A month later, Redline hosted its first charity gala under the Whitmore Foundation. It was Cynthia's idea. A way to merge both worlds quietly. The event was held at a downtown hotel. All glass chandeliers and expensive wine. I stood near the back, keeping to myself, while donors and executives mingled. Henry found me and handed me a drink. "You sure you don't want to take credit for any of this?" he asked. "Half the city's here because of your money." I shook my head. "Credit's for people who need to be seen. I'm just glad it's working." He looked at me carefully. "You've changed, Mike. But not in a bad way." Before I could answer, a familiar laugh drifted across the room. My chest tightened. Lauren. She walked in on Trevor's arm, dressed like someone who never lost a thing in her life. She spotted me almost immediately. Her smile faltered. "Just a little." "Michael," she said as she approached. "Didn't expect to see you here. Fancy place for a janitor turned truck driver." Trevor chuckled beside her. The same smug grin as always. I kept my voice steady. Even janitors can get invited to nice places if they work hard enough. She tilted her head. "Work hard, or marry rich." Henry stepped forward, but I raised a hand. "It's fine," I said. Then I looked at her straight on. "You always said money makes the man. Maybe you were right. But you never said what it makes him capable of." Before she could respond, the event host walked to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "please join me in welcoming tonight's guest of honor, the benefactor whose vision has helped rebuild this city's scholarship network, the Whitmore Foundation's silent partner." Lauren's smile froze. Trevor frowned. The lights shifted, and the host continued. We are proud to recognize Mr. Michael Grant. The room erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. Lauren's face went pale. Henry clapped me on the back and whispered, "Guess the secret's out." I didn't move. I just stood there, staring across the room at the woman who once told a judge that poor fathers didn't deserve their kids. The moment hung in the air like the end of a long war. Then I stepped forward. I could feel every eye in that ballroom. The heat of the lights, the sharp smell of cut flowers and camera flash powder. I walked to the podium because there was nothing else to do. I kept it short. I thanked the drivers who kept oxygen moving during blackouts, and the dispatchers who slept on couches beside ringing phones. And I said the only names that mattered tonight were the students who would not have to choose between rent and textbooks. I did not look for Lauren in the crowd, but I felt the chill of her attention like a draft under a door. Trevor stood stone still with the smile men wear when their face has nowhere else to go. Afterward, hands and business cards came at me like hail. Henry moved beside me, large and calm, and steered people away with a look that said later. Cynthia gave me a nod that meant breathe. By the time I made it to the curb, the night was cool and the streets were mostly empty. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number said nice performance. Janitor. I deleted it. The point of tonight was never them. The morning headlines were smaller than the photos made me fear. A foundation dinner in Dallas is not national news, and I wanted it that way. Our work belonged in the logistics pages and the education pages, not the gossip ones. I kept my head down, showed up for the early dispatch call, and reminded the team that nothing had changed about the loads on the board. The world could name a room after you, and the pallet still had to move. Weeks turned into months. Summer baked North Texas until the air shimmered on the highway. Redline settled into a bigger rhythm. We brought on veteran drivers who taught the younger guys how to read weather by the smell of the wind. The routing team trained a model to predict delays at the warehouse docks, and it turned out to be right more often than I expected. I started sleeping 6 hours some nights. That felt like luxury. UCLA reached out through the Community Foundation about a fall ceremony to recognize long-term scholarship partners. The invitation was formal and plain. The kind of letter you want to frame because it means you did something without talking about it. I said yes, but prepped myself to sit in the back row and clap for other people. Cynthia suggested we let them use my name if they asked. I told her I would not ask for that, but I would not run from it either. On the day of the ceremony, I flew into Los Angeles early. The air felt different there. Salt and sun and a little gasoline. I walked the campus before the event and watched students move in clusters with coffee cups and earnest faces. Every few steps, I saw a parent carrying a box or a lamp, and it hit me again that money is a tool to move weight other people cannot carry. I found the art building and sat on a low wall until Emma texted that she was free for lunch. She arrived in sneakers and a denim jacket with paint under the cuff. We ate at a crowded cafe where everyone looked like they had a deadline and loved it. She told me about a professor who talked too fast. A group project that actually worked. A night she slept on the studio floor and woke up with an idea that made sense. I told her about a driver who taught himself Spanish at rest stops, and a dispatcher who could hear a lie in a mileage number. We did not mention the ceremony. We did not need to. Late afternoon. The auditorium filled with faculty, donors, students, parents. The stage was a clean line of chairs and a lectern. The lights warmed the wood until it glowed. I took a seat near the aisle 5 rows back and tried to be smaller than I am. Across the room, I saw Lauren and Trevor enter together, tailored and camera ready. They sat in the front, turned slightly so anyone behind them could read their profiles. I could feel the old heat rise in my chest. The one that takes your breath before it lets you speak. I told it to sit down and be quiet. The dean opened with the numbers. Retention up. Debt down. First-generation students doubling in programs that used to be gated by quiet money and loud tradition. Names were read. Hands were shaken. Applause rolled like low surf. I clapped until my palms stung. For a while, I forgot about everything except the faces of kids who refused to be told no. Halfway through, the dean paused and looked down at her notes. She spoke about a partner who had funded gaps, not headlines, who had asked for no building and no spotlight. She thanked the community foundation that had been the conduit for discretion, and then she said a name. My name. My breath caught like a gear tooth. I did not stand at first. It took a beat for the room to turn and find me. Then I rose, and the applause was not a wave this time. It was a rush that hit harder than any sound I have ever known. I looked across the first row and saw Lauren freeze. Trevor blinked like a man coming out of a dark room too fast. Emma was on her feet before I could see her face. The dean beckoned me to the stage, and I walked the aisle with my hands down. Palms open. I shook the hand of a dozen strangers who said thank you without moving their lips. I reached the lectern, and the light made me blink. I told the room that my name on a slide meant less than the names behind me. The ones who would design hospitals and bridges and books that do not exist yet. I said the fund started because the math did not work for kids with talent and rent due. I said we were going to keep going as long as the work stayed honest. It took less than a minute. It took 10 years. When I stepped away, Emma met me at the edge of the stage. She put both arms around my neck and pressed her face into my shoulder the way she did when she was little and the carousel went too fast. I felt her say the words more than I heard them. I knew it was you. I have known since high school. I kept it quiet because this moment needed to belong to you and not to a fight. I did not trust my voice. So I nodded. She pulled back and looked at me, the way a person looks at a horizon. The crowd was still clapping. The sound blurred into one long ribbon and tied around us. We sat together while the ceremony closed. A quartet played a song I used to hear on the radio on late drives home from the warehouse. The dean spoke about gratitude and stewardship, and the difference between being lucky and being generous. I watched the stage lights soften and make circles on the floor, and I thought about nights I spent mopping in a building like this, listening to other people's footsteps and promising a girl in Texas that someday I would buy her time. After the program, the lobby turned into a maze of small talk and cookies on silver trays. Faculty shook my hand and said the right things. Students grabbed a photo and tried not to make it weird. A few parents squeezed my elbow like they were finding a railing in a crowded stairwell. I found a quiet corner with paper cups of lemonade and waited. It did not take long. Lauren approached with the tight smile of someone walking across a thin pond. Trevor hovered at her shoulder and kept adjusting his cuff like the fabric had started to itch. She stopped in front of me and let the silence swell. Emma stepped closer. Not touching anyone. Just present. Lauren said it softly so only we could hear. So this is what you have been doing. Playing philanthropist while letting me carry the story. I kept my eyes on her face. I told her the story carried itself. Emma earned every inch of this. All I did was move a wall she never needed to see. She glanced toward the dean. Toward the photographers who had drifted away toward more interesting faces. Then she looked back at me and something brittle in her expression gave way. For a second I saw the college girl who used to fall asleep on the couch while we watched late games in a cheap apartment with a loud fridge. The girl we both failed when we started measuring love in invoices and receipts. Trevor cleared his throat and asked a question that was not a question. How much did this cost you? I said he was asking the wrong math. The number that mattered was the one on a transcript. Not a check. He laughed without humor and called me lucky. I told him luck is a word men use when they do not see someone else working. He stared like I had moved his chair while he was sitting in it. Lauren took his arm and told him she needed air. They left without saying another word. Emma watched them go with a face I could not read. Then she let out a breath she had been holding for years. We walked back toward the steps of the auditorium. Evening had cooled the concrete. The jacarandas threw purple shadows like confetti. Emma took my hand the way she had when she was 5. Not because she needed to be led, but because she wanted to be sure I was real. We stood there for a long minute while the campus thinned, and the custodial crew wheeled out gray bins, and the band packed up cases. She told me she would come to Dallas after finals and spend a week at the warehouse, learning how roots become trucks and become groceries on shelves. I told her I would clear my calendar and actually do it this time. We did not say the word promise, because we both understood that promises are lighter than schedules. A student walked by humming, and for some reason it made me think of the first night it snowed when I was a kid in Austin. How quiet the world got, and how even ugly parking lots look new under a clean sheet. That was what tonight felt like. The same buildings. The same people. But everything covered in the kind of quiet that comes when the noise finally quits. Emma squeezed my hand and said we should get food. She wanted tacos from a truck that only takes cash and a soda in a glass bottle that is too cold for your teeth. I told her that sounded like a perfect idea. We started down the steps together, careful in the dim light. At the bottom, she let go of my hand and skipped the last 2 like a kid again. Turned back with a smile that could have powered the stage lights for another hour. And waited for me to catch up. We walked toward the food truck, parked under a string of dim lights. The kind that hum softly and make the air feel warmer than it is. The smell of grilled meat and cilantro carried on the breeze. Emma ordered for both of us. The way she used to pretend to when she was little. Standing on tiptoe to see over the counter. We ate leaning against the hood of my rental car. The sound of traffic mixing with the laughter from a nearby group of students. For the first time in a long time, life felt ordinary in a way I hadn't realized I missed. She asked what it felt like to be rich. I told her it felt the same. Except, the bills stopped shouting. She laughed and said that was a very dad answer. Then she asked if I'd ever thought about slowing down. I told her I was trying to. But slowing down is harder than starting over. She nodded like she understood. And maybe she did. We finished our food in silence. And when she yawned, I drove her back to her dorm. She hugged me tight before running inside. I waited until the door closed before I started the car. The flight home was quiet. I stared out the window as the city lights disappeared below me, thinking about how the same sky stretches over every version of a man's life, no matter how far he runs. When I landed, I went straight to the office. The sun was just rising over the Dallas skyline, turning the glass towers gold. Inside, Henry was already there, pouring coffee. He looked up and grinned. "You made the news again," he said, sliding a paper across the table. The headline read, "Texas Philanthropist, Honored for University Impact." My picture was small, buried under a quote about education reform. I smiled. Small photo. Perfect. He laughed. "You know, Mike, I never thought I'd work for a billionaire who still cleans his own coffee mug." I told him I wasn't a billionaire. He said the bank might disagree. Then his tone softened. "You did it. Man. You built something that actually matters." I told him we built it. He shook his head. "Nah. You carried it. We just held the ladder." That afternoon, I visited the Red Line Driver's Lounge. The walls were covered with photos of every truck, every crew that had stuck with us through the chaos. I looked at those faces, tired but proud, and realized they were the backbone of everything I had built. I made a decision that day. We launched a new profit-sharing plan that same month. Every driver, mechanic, and dispatcher got a cut of the growth they helped create. The looks on their faces when they got their first bonus checks reminded me of the first time I saw Emma walk across a stage. Pride looks the same in every language. In the months that followed, Redline expanded again, this time into renewable transport. We added electric routes, clean fleets, and even started developing a training program for veterans transitioning into logistics. The Whitmore Foundation funded it quietly under a different name. I didn't want people to see charity. I wanted them to see opportunity. The same kind that had been given to me when I thought I was finished. One evening, about a year after the UCLA ceremony, I got a call from the university. They were holding an event to honor new graduates. And Emma would be speaking as valedictorian of her program. I booked a flight without telling her. When she took the stage that day, she stood tall, confident, eyes bright. She talked about the value of perseverance, about how success wasn't measured in trophies or headlines, but in the moments no one else saw. Then she paused, looked right at me, and said, "My father taught me that the hardest work is the kind no one applauds until long after it's done." The applause that followed was thunderous, but I barely heard it. I just sat there, proud, knowing she had learned the one thing I wanted her to know, that love and work, when done right, are the same thing. After the ceremony, she found me outside under a tree near the parking lot. The same kind of tree that had stood outside our old house on Maple Street all those years ago. She smiled and said, "You didn't think I'd notice you sneaking in, did you?" I laughed. "You used to say I was too loud to sneak anywhere." She nodded. "You still are." We talked for a long time. About her plans. About Redline. About the foundation. She wanted to start her own design firm one day. One that worked with sustainable infrastructure projects. I told her she'd have a client waiting when she did. Before she left, she said something that stayed with me. "You know, Mom still doesn't understand how you did it. She says, money changed you." I told her it didn't. It just made the world finally see what you already were. Then she hugged me, tighter than she had in years, and said she'd see me soon. That night, back in my hotel room, I sat by the window and watched the lights spread across the city. Somewhere in that glow, my daughter was celebrating the start of her own life. Somewhere else, a driver was finishing his route and heading home. Somewhere, a scholarship check was clearing for a student whose name I'd never know. I thought about my grandmother, about the empire she built out of guilt, about how she'd given me the means to rewrite what legacy meant. Money couldn't buy forgiveness, but it could build bridges long enough for it to cross. When I returned to Dallas, I drove past the old courthouse, where everything had fallen apart years earlier. The building was still there, old and square and ordinary. I parked across the street for a minute and watched people walk in and out. Some of them were probably going through the same kind of pain I'd carried that day. I wished I could tell them that sometimes losing everything is just the start of seeing clearly. But no one would have believed me then either. You have to live it to understand. Later that evening, I stopped by the Redline yard. The last trucks were rolling in under the floodlights. Engines cooling. Metal ticking. I walked through the rows. The smell of diesel and dust thick in the air. One of the younger drivers waved and called out, "Heading home." "Boss," I smiled. "Yeah, for once." He laughed and shouted, "You earned it." Maybe I had. Maybe that was what all of this was about, earning peace 1 mile at a time. I drove home and sat on the porch for a long while, watching the sky fade from pink to deep blue. The cicadas were loud. The kind of sound that fills the empty spaces without asking permission. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I owed the world an explanation. I didn't feel like a man proving something. I just felt like a father who finally kept his promise. If you've made it this far, maybe you know what I learned. That sometimes revenge isn't about getting even. It's about living better. Louder. Freer than anyone thought you could. It's about choosing grace when bitterness would be easier. And if this story meant something to you, Share it with someone who needs to hear that losing doesn't always mean the end. Sometimes it's just the start of a better fight. Tell me what you took from it. Because stories like this only matter if they remind us what we're capable of when love refuses to quit.